Hello there and welcome to Thursday in Parliament. Coming up on this programme, the Lords warn the government needs to be on its guard against an increase in hate crime.
There has been a 40% increase in hate crime since 2013-14. This is not a spike, this is a trend.
A UKIP peer explains why he wants curbs on immigration.
I have never denied that we need migrants. It's just that we don't want to go on letting in Bulgarian and Romanian gangsters at their will.
And a Conservative peer bids goodbye to Barack Obama.
Tomorrow, my lords, we will be rid of the most useless American president I have ever seen in my entire lifetime.
We'll have more on that a little later. But first, Labour has called on the government to head off a potential wave of hate crime when the Supreme Court makes its expected judgment on Brexit next week. An earlier ruling in the High Court led to a backlash against the judges. The latest crime figures reveal a 40% increase in hate crimes in the month after the referendum vote in England and Wales, compared with the same month the year before. The leader of the Labour peers raised her fears about next week's ruling.
All of us want to maintain good relations with our EU neighbours as we move forward on Brexit, and we do not want another spike in hate crime as we saw following the referendum, or the attacks on judges following the court decision. This week, the Prime Minister said, "Every stray word and every hyped-up media report is going to make it harder for us to get the right deal for Britain." Did the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson not get the memo? And can the noble lady confirm whether the Prime Minister has conveyed to the government's concern to those sections of the media that she was alluding to, that as we all agree, that such histrionic reports can only damage the interest and the reputation of the UK?
Yeah. The Minister said Lady Smith had made a valid point about the spike in hate crime after the referendum.
We all have a duty to behave in a responsible way, but it is in society being not just tolerant but welcoming of the various communities that live in our country that we will make progress, and the media is part and parcel of that.
Can she think of a single precedent where ministers have been asked to ask a hypothetical question in connection with a hypothetical outcome? And is it not extraordinary that it's an order to ask a question of this nature?
Yeah.
Well, it is hypothetical, but I hope that I can reassure my noble friend that, in fact, what this government is prepared and learnt the lessons from some of the events that we have seen in the last year.
The latest crime figures show an increase of about 200 hate crimes a week, 2015-16 compared with the year before. There has been a 40% increase in hate crime since 2013-14. This is not a spike, this is a trend. And police action is simply addressing the symptoms. What assessment has the government made of the causes of these increases? And does the government believe, as we do, that the increase in populism and nationalism is behind these significant and worrying increases?
My Lords, I heard various tales at post-referendum of the various communities and what, yes, and I will get to the point about pre-referendum, because in fact the numbers of hate crimes being reported are now down to pre-referendum levels. The reasons behind some of the hate crime were many and varied. What motivates people to provoke hatred against people, it's many and varied. It's generally based on certain characteristics of those people and of those communities, and it has actually gone down to pre-referendum levels since then.
As someone, and I declare an interest in my work as chair of Kick It Out, where we monitor and have been monitoring for the last 23 years hate incidents which are at the lower level of everyday abuse. There is nothing new about the level of hatred that exists within our society. And we've got to tackle the issue of prejudice, which we're not doing sufficiently. To blame Brexit as a consequence of what we saw on June the 24th and since is actually delusional. Because quite frankly, the levels of homophobic abuse that we are witnessing, disabled people who are being abused, you cannot blame that specifically on Brexit in the context of racial abuse. And so I ask you to consider how we are taking action to effectively tackle prejudice, which is what feeds bigotry and hatred.
Lady Williams agreed it wasn't Brexit per se, but Brexit being used to promote prejudice and hatred, and the government was trying to tackle this. Over in the Commons at Business Questions, an SNP MP was also looking ahead to the Supreme Court judgment due next week. The court will give a final ruling on whether or not Parliament should have a say on triggering Article 50, the formal start of the UK's exit from the EU.
We know now it's almost certain that a bill will be required in order to trigger Article 50. So will he confirm that this bill will be subject to the maximum scrutiny, thoroughly amendable and properly debated in this House? Can we have a debate about how to win friends and influence people? Because the Foreign Secretary is currently touring Europe like a dodgy character out of a low, doing his utmost to upset the very people that global Britain needs to negotiate with to get a good deal about exiting the European Union.
Say this only once.
We now know that this government's predominant obsession, everything that underpins its approach to leaving the European Union, is immigration and freedom of movement. Perhaps it could start by confining the Foreign Secretary to the barracks here.
The government plans a Great Repeal Bill to move EU rules and regulations into UK law. At Prime Minister's Questions, an SNP MP had asked whether the bill would be subject to a process known as English Votes for English Laws, or EVIL, where Scottish MPs are excluded from voting on legislation that applies only to England.
Can the Leader of the House do what the Prime Minister failed to do yesterday, and that's to confirm that the English Votes for English Laws procedure will not be applied to the Great Repeal Bill? This bill will cross across many devolved competencies. It will be a very complicated bill, and there's going to be so many jurisdictions involved when it comes to this. So will we do what the Prime Minister failed to do yesterday and rule out evil today?
The Leader of the House turned first to whether there would need to be a bill in Parliament to trigger Article 50, beginning our exit from the EU.
Clearly, until the Supreme Court has ruled, we don't know whether any bill is going to be required or not. But any bill, if it is to become law, has to go through the full parliamentary process in this chamber and in the other place.
As to English Votes for English Laws,
for any matter to be subject to the EVIL arrangement, it has to meet three tests. It must refer to a matter which is devolved in Scotland. The legislation here must refer only to England or to England and Wales. And third, there must be a certification from Mr. Speaker that the clause or the bill or the statutory instrument meets those tests. Those tests would continue to be the ones that would have to be met in any case. And I think that I think it's very clear to me that if, for example, we look at a measure that is repealing the European Communities Act 1972, clearly that has UK-wide implications and not just applying to one part of the United Kingdom.
David Liddington. Back in the Lords, a Conservative peer has lambasted Barack Obama as the most useless American president in my lifetime. Lord Blencathra was taking part in a debate titled "The Challenges to the Liberal International Order Posed by the Development of Populism and Nationalism Around the World." Donald Trump is due to officially take over as US President on Friday, and Lord Blencathra made clear he'd be glad to see the end of Barack Obama's time in office.
Tomorrow, my lords, we will be rid of the most useless American president I have ever seen in my entire lifetime, whose only legacy is rhetoric. He has withdrawn America from the world stage and left a disastrous vacuum that's been filled by Putin and China. He withdrew troops prematurely from Iraq and allowed ISIL to flourish. He laid down red lines on Syria, on the use of gas in Syria, but did nothing to enforce them when they were breached. He turned a blind eye to Russian hacking for 7 years and 9 months, but suddenly became concerned about when Hillary lost the election. But never mind, he has his place in history. The next time I visit the United States, I'll be able to use the transgender toilets. There is no challenge to the current international order, I'd say to the noble Lord, because I think its time is over and it is finished. No one can accuse the Labour Party of not being democratic. I would never dream of doing that, because they are democratic. And the Independent of 20th December reported, the Labour Party is ramping up preparations to relaunch Jeremy Corbyn as a left-wing populist. Senior party officials believe his unpolished authenticity could gather support from the same anti-establishment that has heralded the popularity of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage. So, my lords, I conclude. There you have it. Populism is a wicked and evil thing if it is a right-wing President Trump, but a great thing if it is a socialist Corbyn. My lords, nobody can do hypocrisy better than the left Liberal elites.
But his worldview was challenged by a former Liberal Democrat leader who urged politicians to leave their tribes and work together to counter the dangerous rise of populism and nationalism. He compared the situation today with the 1930s.
The motto of the age, you will recall, was to, if you're going to lie, lie big and lie often. Stick it on the side of a bus, perhaps, and send it round the country. I think our age bears horrible comparisons with that. I don't say we're not to blame, we are, as the noble Lord Tugendhat said, nor do I say that this was not a rational reaction from those failures. I'm not interested in who to blame, but what to do. Spare a thought for a moment for the lost tribes of Labour and the Tory party. I mean, what do you do these days if you are part of that great Tory tradition of internationalism and now find yourself in a party that has completely abandoned it? What do you do if you're one of those Labour members of Parliament who believes in the free market not as our master but as our servant and finds your party has explicitly rejected it? It's extraordinary in the last year how much politics has spun away to the extremes. And this is the time for us to get out of our tribes and start working together to ensure that we can help build that central consensus, that centrist consensus, that moderate liberal consensus, in which I believe the only chance lies for altering the very dangerous trajectory of our country.
Lord Ashdown, you're watching Thursday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. The best way forward for the troubled region of Kashmir is a referendum, some MPs have suggested, so the people can determine their own future. The problems in Kashmir go back to the late 1940s when the area was divided between India and Pakistan. Both countries, which are now nuclear powers, lay claim to the entire region. The dispute has led to 2 wars and frequent conflicts, and there has been an escalation of violence in recent months.
After 70 years of inaction since the original UN resolutions were passed, requiring this conflict to be resolved by peaceful democratic means, it is easy to see why so many in the Kashmiri community think the United Nations has lost interest in their problem.
He said he appreciated the British government had to tread a careful path.
We wish to be friends with both India and Pakistan, but a candid and true friend is one who sometimes says things that the other friend may find unpalatable. I'll certainly give way to my...
I'm very grateful and I support his motion. Surely it's not a question of supporting either the Indian government or the Pakistan government, it's about supporting the people of Kashmir. Yeah. And just as he and I campaigned for many years for a referendum to decide whether or not our country should be governed by the European Union and part of that, surely the people of Kashmir should be afforded the same liberty of actually deciding how they want to be governed for their future too.
David Nuttall agreed that the people of Kashmir should have the right to self-determination.
A right so historically exercised by the people of this country on the 23rd of June last year, when the majority voted to leave the European Union. No one believes that there is an easy answer, but anything has to be better than having a military-controlled line of partition between 2 neighbouring countries.
Khalid Mahmood, the first MP of Kashmiri heritage, criticised the Indian security forces.
When a man goes out of a house where there is a father, a husband or a son, there's absolutely no guarantee whether it'll come back and what state it'll come back in. What acts will be, we've seen beatings, we've seen videos on YouTube, on Facebook and another media that we have, social media that's available to us, where people are summarily beaten up in the streets, are held by unproportionate amount of military personnel and are beaten literally to within an inch of their life. They are tortured, they are taken away, and people go missing. And in some instances, when they go missing, then nobody comes back.
Another MP whose parents came to the UK from Kashmir talked about the use of pellet guns by Indian forces.
They spray and maim through a 6-foot circle. It is impossible to limit the number of casualties with a 6-foot fan of pellets. These are not precision weapons or defensive weapons, and when used in open public places must constitute a human rights violation.
Virendra Sharma was born in India.
This is why we see images of soldiers across Kashmir. They are there to protect citizens of all stripes. People who want to go to work, school, or university are only allowed to do so under the protection of the Indian Army. Without the protection of Indian troops, we can see too easily what happens. National Human Rights Commission of India have been free to criticize and call for punishment when the rule of law has not been upheld to a rigorous standard. This is not a level of freedom allowed to these residents in Pakistan, recognized as the world's leading sponsor of terrorism.
The Foreign Office Minister Alok Sharma said he was very concerned about violence in Indian-administered Kashmir and that pellet guns had been replaced by chili powder shells. But he said the UK could not prescribe a solution to the situation in Kashmir or act as a mediator. MPs have been holding their annual debate to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, which falls on Friday, the 27th of January. Conservative former Cabinet Minister Sir Eric Pickles recalled a visit to the Nazi extermination camp of Treblinka in Poland and criticised sinister deniers for continuing to say the Holocaust did not happen.
The best estimates is that somewhere between 700 and 900,000 Jews and around 2,000 Roma were killed in Treblinka's gas chambers. More Jews were killed in Treblinka than any other Nazi extermination camp apart from Auschwitz. It's a grim place, and there's a dignified monument and carefully laid wreath, carefully laid stones remembering the different communities. I laid a wreath there, and following the visit, as most politicians do, I tweeted my observations. Within minutes, I received a tweet that said, "No one died at Treblinka. It was a transit camp. There were no gas chambers, no crematorium, and no mass graves." Now, I have no idea, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether the person who sent me that tweet actually believed it or not. And I think it's all too easy to dismiss this as yet another example of our post-truth world, fake news, that's all too prevalent on social media. But I think there's something more sinister going on. To forget or belittle continues the Holocaust. This month we see the release of the film Denial, which depicts the infamous libel trial of the past 20 years involving the American historian Deborah Lipstadt and David Irving. If you've looked at the trailer and looked beneath it, the comments made by people, there are thousands of abusive comments perpetrating the claim that the Holocaust was a fake. Only a few days ago, David Irving claimed that he was inspiring a new generation of Holocaust skeptics. That's a new fancy way of dressing up Holocaust denial.
Sir Eric Pickles. The former UKIP leader, Lord Pearson, has told the House of Lords that we don't want to go on letting in Bulgarian and Romanian gangsters at their will. He was speaking during a question about housing provision, where a minister had been asked how many new homes would be needed to accommodate people coming to live in the UK.
The higher migration scenario of the Department's household projections show that there are projected to be an average of 243,000 new households forming each year between 2014 and 2039. Net migration accounts for an estimated 45% of this growth, In the main scenario, there are projected to be an average of 210,000 households forming per year, of which 37% is attributable to net migration.
A crossbench peer put the figure differently.
It would mean building a home every 5 minutes, night and day, for new arrivals, until such time as we get those numbers down. Now, I know in this House there's a strong view, a strong view that there's a lot to be said for migration. All I'm pointing out is that there are also costs.
My Lords, as I've indicated, just over a third of the growth in the main scenario is attributable to migration. It's a 2-year cycle, so we review the figures every 2 years. So the next review will be at the end of this year, when some of the scenarios may well change because of the impact over the period of Brexit. But the Noble Lord is absolutely right about the challenge of building more houses. That is certainly true. Most of that, as I've indicated, is not to do with migration.
Does the government believe that our National Health Service and our social care arrangements can survive
without migrants?
This sort of population.
That heckle coming from Labour's Lord Fowkes. Lord Pearson pressed on.
My Lords, I have never denied that we need migrants. It's just that we don't want to go on letting in Bulgarian and Romanian gangsters at their will. My Lords, does the government believe that our National Health Service, social care, can survive this sort of increase with its present funding arrangements? Or do we have to consider something more radical for the longer term?
My Lords, if I may try to address the joint question, I think, asked by the Noble Lord Lord Fowkes and the Noble Lord Lord Pearson, it is certainly the case that across broad sections of public life, and certainly including the health service, we're heavily dependent upon people who've descended or from the immigrant community. There's no doubt of that. My Lords, net migration will probably fall as a result of Brexit, but it's going to be some time before that happens. But we face all sorts of challenges in seeking to address that, my Lords. Lord
Bourne, does the coming of power of Donald Trump in the US mean we could end up eating inferior food in the UK? Well, that was the suggestion at the start of the day from a Scottish National Party MP. The Commons was looking at how Britain's departure from the EU will impact on food, farming and the rural economy in general.
President-elect Trump spoke last week of the UK securing a very quick trade deal with the US once it left the EU, which has led to fears that this could mean harsh compromises on issues such as the environment, animal welfare laws and food safety. Will the Secretary of State today reassure this House and people across the United Kingdom that any trade deal with the US will not involve such compromises which will jeopardise our food safety, animal welfare laws, and will the Secretary of State reassure us that she understands that a very quick deal is not necessarily the same as a very good deal for the consumer or the producer?
The party on this side of the House is the only party that made a commitment to reflect animal welfare standards in trade negotiations, and that remains a commitment of the government. There are opportunities for our agricultural sector in the US, particularly in sectors such as dairy and possibly in sectors such as lamb as well. But we will, and my colleagues in the Department for International Trade will obviously lead on these once we leave the European Union, but there will be potential opportunities for the UK industry as well.
90% of our beef and lamb exports from this country are to the EU. Yes. So the Prime Minister's threat to walk away from the single market with no deal for them would not be bad. It could leave them facing tariffs up to 20%, and that would be catastrophic. Yes. What assurances can he give to the farmers and crofters in my constituency that he and his government will not leave them exposed in this way?
Well, I think the Prime Minister gave the assurance that we're seeking a good deal, and that no deal is better than a bad deal, which I don't think anybody can disagree with.
As we free ourselves from the straitjacket of the common agricultural policy that has added so many bureaucratic burdens to our farmers, what assessment has my right honourable friend made of the financial burden that our farmers are facing as a result of the Common Agricultural Policy? And what extra freedom will this mean for our farmers in the future?
Unnecessary rules cost farmers millions of pounds and up to 300,000 man-hours each year, which says nothing of the lost opportunities. So I will be paying very close attention to these issues in the coming months as we look for better solutions that work for us rather than 28 EU member states.
Andrea Ledson. And that's it from me for now. But do join me on Friday night at 11 for a roundup of the best of the week here at Westminster, including a lively debate between the Conservatives, Sir Bill Cash, and the Lib Dems, Lady Ludford, on Parliament's role in Brexit. But for now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.